Hey guys, welcome to another set of video logs. I know, I'm getting into quite a few facets here with my video log reviews. So we had Guilty Pleasure Treasures. This I like to call page turning. Here I want to actually focus on just my own collection of literature. Would be that novels, graphic novels, collected short stories or collected humor works, or just kind of interesting little fiction and non-fiction installments that I've acquired over the years and put into my lovely shelves here. And I thought here to kind of start off with an omnibus of some comic books that I had collected when I was way younger and kind of appreciated then for whatever they were, but now really appreciate now as my knowledge in comics history has expanded. So I wanted to share a little bit about the Simpsons comics, published mainly by Bongo, I want to say, is the main publisher. I never really got into the Simpsons comics so much. The only series that I followed for a while were limited series, like about 6 issues in length. And they consisted primarily of the Bartman comic, because I'm a Bart Simpson fan, and I like the idea of Bartman, and they made a kind of a parallel to Batman in the comics, so that was kind of cool. And Radioactive Man. Now, Radioactive Man, for you Simpsons fans out there, is Bart Simpson's favorite superhero within the show. I believe Rainier Wolfcastle played the character in the live-action movie they made in the show, and Milhouse played Fallout Boy, his sidekick, and Bart was very envious along those lines. But Radioactive Man has shown up throughout the show's history as this cool little background flourish. At one point in the early to mid-90s, Radioactive Man got his own comic book series, a Simpsons spin-off, as it were. And it ran for about 6 issues. It did run for about 6 issues, I want to say. And then he got some backup features in the mainstream Simpsons comics. I've been searching nonstop for this for about 2 years and finally did get it last year because I had lost the originals that I had acquired back in the mid-90s. They might be in my basement somewhere back in Ohio or threw them out. I can't really remember what became of them, but I remember enjoying them enough that I wanted to seek them out again. And that's what brought me to this collection of the Radioactive Man comics run, entitled The Radioactive Repository Volume 1. This is kind of a great little collection if you're either a Simpsons fan or if you're a fan of comics history, actually, because at first, when I first read this series as a kid, I kind of liked it. I got the humor in it more so because I was really into The Simpsons at that point and got the jokes. But even more so than that, now as I reread some of these stories, I appreciate the little jabs it takes at the history of comics in general. Like, it doesn't really narrow it down to just, say, being a Superman or a Batman ripoff. It actually provides a lot of kind of cool, quirky inside jokes at all the twists and turns that have taken place in particularly superhero storytelling since superheroes' inception in the 30s. What this does, essentially, is the Radioactive Man main comic run acted as if this comic book had existed throughout history. Like, I believe its starting date was in 1955 or something like that, was the fictional start date for Radioactive Man. Radioactive Man #1 came out in like 1955. And so they basically check back in with a character, like issue 2 is technically issue 66, or issue 4 is technically in universe number 500 or whatever. The Radioactive Man dies in that issue. So it checks in with a character throughout the decades. So you get a little bit of the 50s, a little bit of the 60s, a little bit of the 70s, 80s, late 80s, and then into the 90s. It's really actually very well done. The parody and the satire is well balanced in these stories. In the 50s, in the very first issue of Radioactive Man, you get a very streamlined origin story that you would get along the lines of, say, a Batman or Superman from 38 or 39. You would get a very simple story, but it has a lot of ties to political events that were taking place during that time. It references the subcommittees that talk about juvenile delinquents and how comic books are a bad influence, and parodies like what was happening with, well, the fictional character in the story is called Gaines, but it's the guy who founded like from the Crypt and Mad Magazine and things of that nature, and kind of parallels that a little bit. You have a Frederick Wortham type character talking about the vices of comic books and how they're bad for your kids' brains and so forth. And he shows up in the issue. And Radioactive Man throughout this whole series is actually uber capitalist. Like, Republicans would love a real life Radioactive Man. He's ultra conservative. He has that gee willikers all shucks mentality in the 1950s, and he doesn't lose that throughout the entire run. He goes well into the 90s, still saying jeepers or still calling people hippie, dirty hippies, and things of that ilk. And it's kind of amusing to see how much the style of the book and how much other characters change to reflect the times that they're supposed to be emulating, but he doesn't. Like, in that sense, it's very Superman-ly. Like, Superman for a long time did not change with regards to image or attitude. He remained perpetually the big blue Boy Scout we all know and love, until about the late 80s or 90s when they finally gussied him up a little bit more, darkened up his character a little bit more, or made him, a little bit more reflective of modern society. But Radioactive Man, throughout this series, is perpetually out of touch. It's really kind of amusing now to see that. At times, I think it was kind of funny just because he would play the straight man to everyone else, but now, as an older reader, and knowing more about not just comic book history, but also about world history and what took place during those decades, it's a lot more enjoyable on that level. And so you've got the 50s era Radioactive Man, and he feels right at home there. But then you have the 60s era where they start to emulate a little bit more of Jack Kirby's art style and Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's storytelling. Fallout Boy, his sidekick, has a very, basically he has his origin tied to Peter Parker in a way. Kind of just as an afterthought, a little in-joke again. The 60s issue definitely reflects the style and execution of Marvel Comics when they first debuted in the 60s. And in the 70s, you get a lot more of the counterculture stuff, a little bit more of the very liberal Green Arrow type. One of his co-stars in the book goes through several changes. He's almost like an Iron Man Green Arrow figure. He's a billionaire who's a superhero. He starts out as the character Purple Heart, becomes Bleeding Heart in the 70s, becomes Heart of Darkness in the late 80s when everything gets grim and Frank Miller-ish, and Bloody Heart finally in the very Liefeld-inspired or Image Comics-inspired last issue. And it's just fun to see all of these different trends and all these different cultural touchstones get mentioned or get some kind of lampooning. And Radioactive Man throughout all of this is still the same bland mom and apple pie type of stereotype or superhero archetype we expect from that early era. There's a lot of other stuff that definitely plays well to an older reader. Nixon. Not going to give too much away, but Nixon is a very recurring theme throughout Radioactive Man's run. He starts off, he's right there in the beginning with him in the 50s, and you touch base with the president throughout all those eras in some way, shape, or form. And the way they do it is actually kind of very clever, but I wouldn't put it past actual Nixon to have thought up some of this stuff. So he's got to fight arch enemies like Dr. Crab or Hypno Head. Sometimes he has like a crossover event parodying Crisis on Infinite Earths and The Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, all condensed into one story. And it's really kind of enjoyable now that I've grown up and read those books. And you can see not just the artistic mentions or the artistic lifts that they take in throughout the series, but what they do to kind of tie in the actual creators. There is a character called Plasmo who's sort of this otherworldly Doctor Strange type of mystic on his team of superheroes. And he does the whole his mantras, and he calls out by the forces of whatever. But if you pay close attention, some of his mantras, some of the spells he casts are actually comic book creators' names written backwards. Like, he casts a spell that has Steve Ditko's name in it. And it's really kind of cool and kind of a nice nod to that artist especially. The art is quintessential Simpsons. I mean, it retains that Simpsons-like look, but what they do with like shading, what they do with, you know, details. Like here's a very, I would say this puts Radioactive Man in the 80s run, but in the 50s he's much more streamlined. He's not quite as muscled or not quite as detailed or shaded as he is in later, you know, later issues. Now the reason I would recommend getting the repository is because there's a lot of great supplemental material in here as well. There is a foreword and an introduction written by Batman the Animated Series co-creator or co-writer Paul Dini. Paul Dini, you might know as being the creator of Harley Quinn. So he writes this fictitious prologue for the book, introducing his connection to the Radioactive Man franchise, and at one point even says, yeah, I was, you know, when we were developing Radioactive Man, the animated series in the early 90s, I lifted heavily from several early issues. And you see designs of almost Bruce Timm-like Radioactive Man. And it's really kind of funny. And he has, like, his own play on the characters. Like, Radioactive Man's arch nemesis, Dr. Crab, looks very much like the animated series Joker in some of the designs. And he created an original sidekick for that character named Haley Claw or something. And it's kind of fun to see all this, like, just goofy stuff, all this goofy supplemental stuff. They talk about Radioactive Man's long-standing relationship with merchandising and all these, like, silly toys, like, from the early 50s, like, Radioactive Man pet smoker, and he's supposed to be, like, smoking a cigarette with you, to him, like, being on the I Love Lucy show. And it's all these fun, subtle nods to how people have welcomed, to some degree or another, superheroes into their pop culture sphere. It's colorful and stuff, so younger readers will enjoy it, and they might even get some of the Simpsons humor. I mean, I got the Simpsons humor, and I think I was about 9 or 10 when I first read this stuff. As an older comics connoisseur, you'll definitely enjoy a lot of the winks and nods that this particular omnibus plays to you. It's very self-referential when it comes to comics history. It's very lovingly paying homage to several different eras throughout comic books history, and does it all with its own kind of charm. It's really charming, and the thing is, you'd think a very set-in-his-ways character like Radioactive Man, a guy perpetually set in the atomic age, would get kind of irritating or boring. And he really doesn't, and that's a great thing, not just about this book, but about, I feel, the best of The Simpsons. They stay perpetually those characters, and events around them change, and the best parts are when you're able to still connect and relate and enjoy those characters for what they are, even though, you know, in this, he's punching hippie demonstrators in the face and saying, like, free love is the worst thing that can ever happen to us. Or when he's pretty much Reagan's lackey in the late 80s. Or when he's stepped over for a darker, more brutal, more padded up and glitzy looking version of himself in the 90s. There's a lot of cool stuff within the Radioactive repository. I'm not quite sure if Volume 2 has ever come out. Like I said, I don't know if there's enough material for a Volume 2 that they could have done, but I would definitely recommend this book. It is a very good read. It's very enjoyable if you're a Simpsons fan, and if at any point you had glimpsed Radioactive Man in your comic shop and thought, like, well, what's that about? I'd recommend picking it up and having a good chuckle. Stay tuned. I'll have another interesting read for you down the line.